and welcome to Facial Paralysis and Bell's Palsy Foundation presents The Psychology of Facial Paralysis and Communication with Dr. Kathleen Bogart. I'm Lisa McKinley, Director of our foundation, and I'm being assisted today by Barbara Pasternacki. Our presentation today will take approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our attendees. You may type your questions at any time in the box on the control panel on the right side of your screen, and Dr. Bogart will answer them as time allows at the end. I would now like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Kathleen Bogart is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Oregon State University, and she's also an international speaker on facial paralysis awareness and disability issues. Welcome, Dr. Bogart. We're happy to have you today.
Thank you. So I'm so happy to be here today. I've been involved with some of the support groups that the Facial Paralysis Foundation has conducted here in the Pacific Northwest. I was born with Mobius syndrome, which is a type of facial paralysis, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So that means that I've been both a participant in support groups and also I've been a speaker in support groups. So I'm really happy to be able to share a good bit of my research about the psychology of facial paralysis today. So today I'll be talking about three main topics. First, I'll be talking about my research on living with facial paralysis and the way that people with facial paralysis adapt and support each other. And next, I'll focus on the way people with facial paralysis interact with people without facial paralysis. And so I'll spend time talking about both the way people with facial paralysis express themselves, and then I'll talk about the way other people without facial paralysis interpret the expressions of people with facial paralysis. And finally, I talk about what I think is the most important aspect, which is facilitating communication between these two groups. So first, we're going to talk about the person with facial paralysis and focus on that. So just as a brief overview, there are many different types of facial paralysis. Many different conditions can result in what I consider to be a similar psychosocial outcome. So although there are many different conditions that can result in the appearance of facial paralysis, many of the shared psychosocial features are the same, such as difficulty communicating and other people's perhaps misunderstandings of people with facial paralysis. So I like to divide different types of facial paralysis into two main groups. Congenital facial paralysis, which people who are born with facial paralysis, and acquired facial paralysis, which is paralysis that's acquired at some point after birth. You'll note that facial paralysis, when all these conditions are combined, affect about 150,000 Americans each year. So that's a fairly significant group of people, although people with facial paralysis as a whole are still considered to be a rare disease or disorder group. So that means that we really need to seek out services from specialists and get a lot of information from patients and other groups. So individuals with congenital facial paralysis often have Mobius syndrome, and that's the condition that I mentioned earlier. That's what I was born with. Mobius syndrome results in in facial paralysis, usually bilateral and fairly complete, and also an impairment in moving the eyes from side to side. And this is resulting from the underdevelopment of the 6th and 7th cranial nerves in the brainstem. There are other ways to be born with facial paralysis. There's a condition called congenital facial paresis, which is similar to Mobius syndrome, although it's hereditary. And also, birth trauma can result in facial paralysis. So simply traveling through the birth canal can compress facial nerves. Sometimes forceps may be involved, and that might also damage the facial nerves. But acquired facial paralysis is much more common than congenital paralysis because there are so many different ways that one can develop facial paralysis over the lifetime. The most common cause of facial paralysis is Bell's palsy, and often people diagnosed with Bell's palsy initially are told it's not too big of a concern, it's temporary, it typically resolves in a few months, although about 15% of people do not recover completely from Bell's, and so that creates a really significant population of people living with protracted facial paralysis. And there are a variety of other ways that damage can occur to the facial nerve, such as through the presence or removal of head and neck tumors and trauma to the facial nerve. So again, although this is a really wide range of causes, throughout my research, especially through interviews with people with facial paralysis, I found some commonalities among all of them. We should note how important facial expression is in typical conversation. There's a great deal of psychological research that suggests that facial expressions are universally produced and recognized across all cultures. And so this means that people with facial paralysis may be unable to participate in one of the only universal languages. Facial paralysis, facial expression also serves to develop rapport and social connectedness. The process of mirroring or mimicking other people's facial expressions during conversation develops empathy as well. However, the face is not the only way that we communicate. Psychologists divide communication channels into 3 different groups. So the face, which is limited in facial paralysis, but the body and the voice are channels that everyone uses and that I have observed people with facial paralysis to use more. And some of my research that I'll tell you about in a minute indeed finds that people with facial paralysis can compensate for less expression in their face by using these other channels. So to get a sense of what people with facial paralysis were experiencing during social interaction, I started off my early work by simply interviewing people and getting a sense of their different opinions. So I conducted a series of focus groups and individual discussions with people with a variety of types of facial paralysis. And so I want to share some quotes from these interviews with you, and I think those of you who are listening who have facial paralysis might resonate with these, and I'd really be interested in hearing from you afterwards if you feel like these are similar to your experience. So one adult with Mobius syndrome noted that she felt that Mobius is the first thing that people notice. And a teen with Mobius said that her experience, you talk to someone for the first time, they might look at you kind of strange and wonder why you talk like that, why you look like that. A woman with neurofibromatosis type 2 observes that she wondered how some of her facial expressions were interpreted by people. She had a sense that communication wasn't happening the same way it did before she had her paralysis. Another woman said, the thing that annoys me the most is that I can't smile symmetrically. And people don't perceive when I'm smiling. People mirror my expressions, and they can tell in their face that they are seeing something distorted. And I found one of the most insightful quotes to be from a teenager with Mobius, and it's a really hopeful quote. She said, I figured out that once you've known people for a long time, they don't notice your Mobius syndrome anymore because your personality overshadows everything else physically. When you first meet someone, all they have to go off of is appearance. But once they find more things about you, it's not as significant because they have other things to replace it. And during these interviews, people generated ideas about how they express themselves when the face isn't as expressive. And so we have a whole list of compensatory expressions that people talked about using. And I use the term compensatory expression to talk about using other communication channels besides the face. So one woman said that she felt like her voice was her face during communication. People use gestures, people use touch to create interpersonal closeness. People used humor to disarm people. And people even use clothing to express their personalities. One woman had taken to wearing a happy face pin, like the one here, and found that people were friendlier to her and more open when she was wearing it. Another really important theme that kept emerging during these interviews was that people noticed their facial paralysis but didn't understand it. And so I note that facial paralysis is a highly visible condition, but it's also unrecognizable. And that means that people don't understand the cause, nature, or accommodations needed for those with facial paralysis. And so that leads people to wonder if they should explain Mobius syndrome or another type of facial paralysis to people to get rid of the feeling of there being an elephant in the room and to help other people understand why they behave in a certain way and help other people to understand to focus less on their facial expressions and to focus more on their other communication channels. And indeed, people wonder about that but aren't quite sure of what to do. And the strategy that most people came up with was, well, we need more public awareness because that would allow people to understand what facial paralysis is, get rid of the constant burning question of whether or not you should have to explain yourself to others. And indeed, that was a much more common request in my interviews than requests for treatments for facial paralysis or cures. It was for social understanding. And the lack of social understanding indeed shows, we find that there are a lot of strange interpretations of people's appearance, simply because people don't understand what facial paralysis is. They see someone who looks different and they think that perhaps the person just got back from the dentist and had a Novocaine shot. One woman said that someone mistook her for having a stroke. And I thought this is a really interesting quote. A teenager decided to explain his facial paralysis to some of his classmates after having been in the class for a while. And one of his friends responded by saying, "Oh, I'm so relieved. I thought it was serious, like you were going to die." So, you know, people care about and are concerned about individuals who they notice have a different appearance. And when they don't have all the information, sometimes they make really inaccurate interpretations and become very concerned about people. So I want to highlight, though, that in in my interviews, people really felt that their interactions were generally more positive than negative. They felt that the teen years were hardest, but isn't that kind of true for many, many different people, right? And if they experienced bullying, that was typically the time that they experienced it, and that was common. And the big conclusion is that facial paralysis involves a struggle to be understood at many levels. Of course, the lack of facial expression means that people may misunderstand your emotions. Sometimes people have speech difficulty, and of course, they may misunderstand what you're trying to say. But on a higher level, the lack of public awareness means that people make inaccurate assumptions about you, or they may interpret people with facial paralysis as being intellectually disabled as well, or as being unfriendly or uninterested in interacting. And then, of course, the prejudice and stigma associated with having a visible difference or disability is another challenging thing. So one of the things that I was interested in was looking at the way that people with facial paralysis can support each other. And so a recent study that I did looked at what happens when people attend support meetings. I had this idea that the rarity of facial paralysis means that you might never meet another person on the street in your town with your condition. And so you can feel extremely isolated. And the idea is that being surrounded by other people who look like you and share your experiences might really be destigmatizing. And also for parents with facial paralysis, for parents of people with facial paralysis, meetings might serve a slightly different purpose in which they get information about how to help their children manage their condition. And so I conducted a study involving the Mobius Syndrome Foundation Conference, which is a conference that's held every 2 years, and it involves usually 300 or 400 people in attendance, and it's held over the course of a couple days, and it involves informational sessions about treatment and medical advice, and it also allows for a lot of social events and interaction. And so I wanted to look at whether people who chose to go or to not go to the Mobius Syndrome Foundation experience different outcomes. So we collected data from 47 adults with Mobius syndrome and 48 parents of people with Mobius syndrome. And we had them complete a survey 1 month before and 1 month after the foundation conference. And in that survey were standardized measures of social comfort, stigma, and self-efficacy, as well as an item about their perceived knowledge of Mobius syndrome. And so we found that in adults with Mobius, those who attended the conference this time showed a change in their social comfort, reduced stigma, and increased knowledge after attending the conference. Now, the people who did not attend the conference that year didn't show that change. So that does suggest that there is a boost in these factors after attending the conference. Now, in parents, the effects were less pronounced, and we found a general correlation between repeated attendance at conferences and feeling a sense of self-efficacy for supporting one's child with a rare condition, and an association with increased knowledge. So this suggests that these face-to-face meetings are particularly beneficial for people with facial paralysis. They also seem to be beneficial for parents, but they're not getting the same level of change. Indeed, this might be because parents are seeking information, and they may be able to find a lot of this information online already. And I wanted to share some comments from this study from our participants. One person said, I felt like I was not the only one with Mobius, and I felt like I was part of a big family. I found a place here. Words were not necessary to establish acceptance and feel a part of a community. It's important to stay connected with others who have Mobius. Growing up with Mobius is an experience very few people in the world can truly understand. Giving and receiving support is incredibly important. Also, I like to show new parents that things get better over time. I enjoy and embrace being a silent role model for parents and kids. So you can see people felt a variety of different types of positive benefits, from serving as a role model to feeling a part of the community and feeling normalized for a weekend. And of course, this study was focused on the Mobius Syndrome Conference, but I believe that these sorts of benefits would occur at many different types of support groups and meetings, and it would be wonderful to study this in the future. So now I want to focus on some of the ways that people might adapt to having facial paralysis. And from my interactions with people with a variety of types of facial paralysis, I developed the hypothesis that there might be differences in adaptation between those who have congenital conditions and those who have acquired conditions. And that's because people with congenital conditions have never relied on their face to communicate, and so maybe went through their initial development expressing themselves with other channels. And they've had a long time to adapt, their entire lives. Whereas acquired people often talked about feeling like they had to relearn how to communicate and feeling like they had to adjust to people's changed perceptions of them after they developed paralysis. Previous research had looked at psychological distress among people with facial paralysis and found high rates of it. But when I went back to look at the studies in detail, these studies had mostly acquired participants in them. Just a few people with congenital conditions were in there, and because congenital is less common. And indeed, the people who had acquired their facial paralysis had acquired it relatively recently. So I thought that maybe these high levels of anxiety and depression might be due to the acquired nature of the samples and might reduce over time, or might be different among people with congenital conditions. So in an early study, I examined anxiety and depression among people with congenital facial paralysis and compared them to people without paralysis, and found that there were no differences in their anxiety and depression. So this is one indication that there might be differences in adaptation between these two types of paralysis. And then I wanted to explicitly compare these two groups, and for the first time capture the way that people with facial paralysis are expressing themselves. And so we conducted a set of videotaped interviews of 27 people with congenital or acquired facial paralysis, about half and half. And during the interview, we had them perform what we called an emotion recall task, where we asked them to remember an event when they were feeling sad and try to relive that experience a bit while describing it. And we had them do the same thing for happiness. And we did happiness at the end because we like to leave people on a happy note. So my hypothesis here was that people with congenital facial paralysis would use more of that compensatory expression than those with acquired facial paralysis. Again, compensatory expression is the use of expressive channels other than the face, so the body and the voice. And so To do that, we measured their use of compensatory expression with a variety of different strategies. So we measured the words that they used using a computer program that counts the use of emotion words. And then we had trained research assistants who were blind to the hypotheses, watch the videotapes, and rate the quality, intensity, and frequency of vocal and bodily expressions. And so here's what we found. As we expected, people with congenital facial paralysis use more emotion words and use more vocal expressivity than those with acquired paralysis. We found a similar finding when it came to bodily expressivity, although these results were not significantly different. They were kind of on the borderline there. We found that people with congenital used more bodily expression when they were talking about a happy event, but when they were talking about a sad event, the two groups did not differ. And considering those results further, it makes sense because we don't express sadness with a lot of bodily expressivity. So it seems like congenital individuals may have been amping up the expression specifically where it counts. So now I want to take another look at interaction and focus on the other party in the interaction, the person without facial paralysis, and how they form impressions of people with facial paralysis. So I'm going to tell you about a series of studies that we did. We call them first impression studies in psychology, and this is a very common paradigm. When we do these studies with people in the typical population who don't have facial paralysis, we know that we can show a very quickly displayed photo or a very short video, about 5 seconds, and other people are able to look at those stimuli and detect what emotion that person is feeling, or certain personality traits and social attributes like extroversion. So people are amazingly accurate and quick at making these social judgments, but that's when the people in the videos have facial expression available to them. So we wanted to see what would happen if we showed videos of people with facial paralysis. And so I'm going to summarize at least 4 studies here, and you can see the citations at the bottom. And the reason I'm going to summarize them all together is that our results are remarkably consistent. So what we did was show videos of either people with facial paralysis or people with Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is another condition that results in impairment in expression sometimes. Individuals with Parkinson's disease have trouble initiating movement in their faces, and so sometimes their expressions are dampened or slowed. And so we showed very short clips, about 20 seconds long, and indeed some of the clips of the people with facial paralysis were the same clips that we collected in a previous study that I described. And then we had our participant perceivers come in and watch those videos and form impressions about them. And so we had a variety of types of perceivers. We had college students. We had older adults who would serve as the peer group for people with Parkinson's disease. And we had healthcare practitioners. And so our findings in these studies, as I said, were remarkably significant with large effects that when rating people with low facial expressivity, perceivers think that they are less happy and extroverted, and they have less desire to form, to approach them and to form relationships with them. Now, that may not surprise you if you live with facial paralysis, or just thinking about what I've been saying about the importance of facial expression. However, something that was really surprising and heartening to me was that we found that people who use more compensatory expression were rated more positively, regardless of how severe their facial paralysis was. So this is a really important finding that suggests that compensatory expression is a useful and successful strategy to improve other people's impressions of you and to communicate positively. We also found, somewhat surprisingly, that healthcare practitioners who had expertise in facial movement disorders had the same biases as lay people. And of course, this is very surprising when I communicate these results to healthcare professionals. They're understandably upset because they are well-meaning and they want to understand their patients and connect with them. And you know, this doesn't say anything bad about the healthcare practitioners in this study. It simply demonstrates that it's really hard for people to override this natural human tendency to form impressions based on facial expressions. Doctors are people too, and they form first impressions very quickly and automatically based on the same cues that lay people do. Of course, when I tell doctors about these findings, they want to know what they can do to improve interactions. And so we've been working on different projects to help facilitate communication between these two groups. So I'll tell you about a project focused on helping the person with facial paralysis if they feel they need social skills support. And also one focused on perceivers to help with sensitivity training and education about facial paralysis. So I want to tell you about a social skills workshop that we did with 5 teenagers with Mobius. And of course, note that it was only with 5 teenagers with Mobius, so we consider this a very preliminary study. We took a social skills workshop that was created by Changing Faces, the UK charity for people with facial disfigurement. And with their permission, we modified it a bit to include some information that would be specific to facial paralysis. Particularly, we included information about compensatory expression. And so these teenagers participated in a 2-day workshop, and it involved a group discussion and exercises and role play, a bunch of different strategies. And the topics we covered included specific strategies for troublesome situations, for example, how to explain Mobius syndrome to others, of course, compensatory expression, as I mentioned. And in order to measure whether some change in social skill occurred over time, we conducted some videotaped interactions with those participants and lay participants who did not have facial paralysis before and after their workshop. So each Mobius participant interacted with 3 different participants before, and then 3 separate participants after the workshop. And we found that when we used trained coders who were blind to the hypothesis, when they watched those videos from those interactions, that both the people with Mobius and the people without Mobius seemed to express more rapport, facial expressiveness, and gesturing, which is a really interesting finding. We were hoping this would improve in people with facial paralysis, but we didn't know if it would transfer to the other person as well. But this suggests that when the person with facial paralysis has support with their social skills, that they're able to make the other person more comfortable as well. And so we're hoping to hone this workshop and build it further with larger samples in the future. And now I want to focus on the other thing that we're doing to improve interactions for people with facial paralysis, and that is training perceivers or lay people about facial paralysis. And so in a preliminary study, we did this by using the same first impressions type of paradigm that we used before, where we showed 20-second clips of people with facial paralysis. But in this time, we tweaked one thing. Half of the participants got education about facial paralysis before they watched the videos. And so this education included the things that I talked about throughout this talk, things like the cause, nature, and accommodations needed for facial paralysis. And again, the accommodations needed are simply for people to pay attention to the other communication channels that they're using. And I should also note that this education was really quick to deliver. It was just a couple of paragraphs long for people to read, so basically a pamphlet's worth. And then we had these participants watch the videos and rate their first impressions of the extroversion of people with facial paralysis. And so we did find that individuals who received education rated people with facial paralysis as more extroverted. So this is some preliminary evidence that this sort of education can be helpful when forming positive impressions about people with facial paralysis. So we're working on honing the type of education that we're providing and hoping to develop education for doctors and for educators and other people who are likely to encounter people with facial paralysis. And one of the ways that we've been kind of honing this and testing this out is through some activism online and at Oregon State University, where I am a professor. So for the past couple of years, for Mobius Syndrome Awareness Day, which is January 24th, my students and I have been holding an Awareness Day event in the quad. And so if you were to come to our event, you would get an info card like the one you see here and a wristband. And you'd have a conversation about what facial paralysis is, what Mobius syndrome is, and have a chance to have your questions answered. And we also ask people to consider the different ways that everyone expresses themselves. So we're trying to raise awareness about expressive diversity. So we ask them to fill out a sign that says, I express myself with, and then they can fill it out with whatever they feel like. So here's mine. I express myself with cooking. I have a cooking blog. And you can see that this was actually quite a hit. This is just a really small sample of the many people who participated both in the quad and on social media with the hashtag Mobius Awareness. So we had a variety of ways of expressing ourselves, including creativity and data and reading to riding dirt bikes. And so I really love reading all the ways that people express themselves. So I want to conclude by saying, by reiterating that people with facial paralysis really benefit from supporting each other. So being involved with a foundation like the Facial Paralysis and Bell's Palsy Foundation or something like the Mobius Syndrome Foundation can be really rewarding and beneficial in reducing stigma. And people with facial paralysis have a variety of useful strategies for social success, such as the compensatory strategies I've mentioned. And people who are interacting with them can learn to look beyond face value to improve their impressions. And to do that, public awareness is crucial so that others know that, how to accommodate us. And so With that, I will say thank you so much to the Facial Paralysis Foundation for hosting this webinar. I also want to acknowledge my Disability and Social Interaction Lab and all of the wonderful undergraduates and graduates who have helped me over the years to conduct these studies. And as you can see, there are a variety of foundations and funding sources that have helped me over the years. And if you're interested in learning more about my research or have questions later on, you can contact me through my email or look at my website. So thank you so much, and I'm interested to hear what questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Webb, for your presentation. I have a few questions, and also I see a couple of people have hands raised. If you can, just go ahead and type your question in the question box underneath, and Barbara or I will ask it directly. But first question, should I tell other people when I meet them about my facial paralysis?
So that is a question that I get a lot, and when we do our interviews, people often kind of wonder about that. You know, in many ways, raising awareness is so important to improving the lives of not just, you know, one person with facial paralysis, but, you know, everyone as a group. But that doesn't mean that you have to go around telling everyone that you meet that you have facial paralysis. Of course, that's kind of tiresome at some points. But I would encourage you to talk openly about it with people who are close to you or people who you anticipate becoming close with. So, of course, family, friends, people who you foresee yourself becoming romantically involved with and things like that. Just explaining what facial paralysis is and how it affects you, and also kind of talking about some of the positive aspects that it might have brought to your life. I find that people are pretty good at thinking about what facial paralysis has helped them do, helped them grow, helped them learn, and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, do you want to ask the next question?
I do. We got a question from Beth, and it was early on in your presentation. She said she thought a slide said that people with congenital facial paralysis may have lower rates of anxiety and depression than people with acquired facial paralysis, and she wanted clarification there. And she also added, by the way, your hypothesis makes sense to her, and she said she can't relate to sometimes in the support groups to how absolutely devastated some people were when they got Bell's palsy because she had a congenital condition and just kind of lived with it. So
I see. Yeah, interesting. Sometimes that is my experience as well. That I'm surprised to hear the stories of people with acquired conditions because it is such a difference, such an adjustment. Yes, my slide did say that people with congenital may have lower rates of anxiety and depression. My study did not directly compare those two groups, so we can't say for sure. But my study, in context of a bunch of other studies that have looked at mostly acquired conditions, those studies that focus on acquired condition found high rates. So that, in line with the findings that people with congenital may have more of these compensatory expression strategies, might suggest that, you know, over time they've developed more adaptations.
Okay, great. I'll ask another question. This is from Faye. When you were discussing compensatory strategies, did you notice any differences among like different groups of people, say age, gender, race, and which ones used you know, which ones were likely to develop, you know, better strategies than others? Anything along that line?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, with the size of the sample that we had, we weren't able to make distinctions based on age or gender or race or things like that. We only had 27 participants in total, and it's always a challenge to conduct research with people with facial paralysis, as we know, because we're kind of rare and hard to find. But that's something that I'd really be interested in looking at in the future. Talking about this issue with people over the years, I've come to suspect that women may develop more compensatory expression because women are expected, due to social norms, to be more expressive than men overall. So that may prompt them to try to kind of beef up their expression in a different way. Although, as I said, I don't have data to speak to that.
Great. Okay, Barbara, did you have another one?
Yeah, the next one we have is, as a parent of someone with facial paralysis, how do I support my child?
So parents, I find, are often most concerned with finding out information for their children, which is really important when you're raising a young child, right? Some of the most challenging times for a person with facial paralysis, if that person had the paralysis when they're young, are things like learning to eat, learning to speak, and maybe dealing with any other physical disabilities that might go along with it, like widespread muscle weakness that sometimes occurs with Mobius syndrome. So seeking information from other parents and from support organizations like the Facial Paralysis Foundation and the Mobius Syndrome Foundation can be really crucial. Of course, seeking help from and advice from medical professionals is a wonderful opportunity. Many people who don't live in towns with large medical schools or hospitals will find that there are no experts that really know the details of their child's condition. So seeking that support from other parents and organizations, in that case, may be the best bet. And also telling their children about their condition at an age-appropriate time and early on, kind of ramping up. So as the child grows up, as the child starts to interact with other kids, you might notice your kid looking in the mirror, kind of looking at their smile and things like that. And that would be a great time to talk about how there are many physical differences and mental differences in the world, and that's what makes people unique. And giving your kid a positive outlook about what the facial paralysis is, and giving them an opportunity to interact with other kids their age with that same condition, so they don't feel alone, and so they feel that they can talk about it with someone else.
Okay. Another question. This is kind of general in nature, but is there any specific place, you know, where could people go to get help with social skills training associated with facial paralysis? Or do you know, or to learn like compensatory skills?
So let's see. I think various support organizations might be a good bet. So I know the Mobius Syndrome Foundation is interested in continuing to run the workshop that I ran. Changing Faces, as I mentioned before, is a wonderful organization with many different workshops. They're in the UK, of course, but they also have a variety of online resources that people can seek out if they go to their website. So booklets about social skills and things like that that could be really useful.
Okay, great, great. I'm just going to, I have one last question, and then we'll wrap up for the day. And how can I raise awareness within my community and within my family about facial paralysis? I know you spoke on this generally, but any other last thoughts?
Yeah, well, I really encourage people to do that. I can tell you from personal experience that it's really empowering, and it feels great to help the community and also to kind of increase personal understanding. So I think a great way to start raising awareness is by doing social media awareness events. So, of course, right now we have Facial Palsy Awareness Week, and it might be a great opportunity to write a short message to your followers or your Facebook friends and explain what your condition is, and maybe give a link to a foundation or to one of the wonderful videos that have been created to raise awareness about different types of facial paralysis. On my own website that's listed below, I offer lots of resources to help raise awareness. So you can download postcards that I made, the info cards. Those info cards were specific to Mobius syndrome because we were doing it for Mobius Awareness Day, but that information could be really easily modified to all types of facial paralysis because there really are so many commonalities. And the same thing goes for the how do you express yourself signs. That could be for Mobius syndrome, or that could be for facial paralysis in general, and it's a nice way to get your friends involved in supporting you.
Great. I was also going to add on that too, for Facial Paralysis Awareness Week. If you go to our Facebook or Instagram sites, we've got some nice, we've got some photo opportunities and some information and patient stories this week. So anyone's welcome to go there and look. Barbara, did you have any more questions?
I had one more question, Dr. Bogart.
Okay.
One person typed in, what do you find is the best way to communicate with health professionals that are unfamiliar with Mobius?
Okay, yeah, so that happens a lot, and from personal experience, I know that as well. And that also happens beyond Mobius syndrome, right? Many doctors aren't familiar with different types of facial paralysis. I honestly come to expect that now. If I'm not going to a facial paralysis specialist, I come prepared to explain facial paralysis to them. And I don't get upset with someone for not understanding it or not having already known about it. I explain how it affects me. And, you know, often it's not the reason I'm showing up to a medical appointment. So then I say, you know, hey, you'll notice that I have this. Don't think it's related to the current thing, but I wanted you to know because you would probably notice some differences. And if you're feeling uncomfortable explaining it to doctors, it might also help to bring some informational material. So you could bring information specific to your condition. Again, I'll plug my website and our materials. You can go and bring the postcard to info card to the medical professional and maybe have some talking points about that. But although this might seem uncomfortable at first, you're actually doing the medical profession and the facial paralysis community a great service by helping to educate.
Great. We are going to conclude the webinar now today. We did have a couple of medical-related specific questions, but if you could please just email us at facialparalysisfound@gmail.com with those. We aren't able to answer those during the webinar. But other than that, thank you to everyone that attended today, and thank you, Dr. Bogart. It was really informational. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website within probably a few days to a week, and you can watch the recording as many times as you'd like. And thank you again to everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.